All right, good afternoon. Today we are going to be continuing Slaughterhouse 5. We are on chapter 3. Let us begin. The Germans and the dog were engaged in a military operation which had an amusingly self-explanatory name, a human enterprise which is seldom described in detail, whose name alone, when reported as news or history, gives many war enthusiasts a sort of post-coital satisfaction. It is, in the imagination of combat's fans, the divinely listless love play that follows the orgasm of victory. It is called mopping up. The dog, who sounded so ferocious in the winter distances, was a female German shepherd. She was shivering. Her tail was between her legs. She had been borrowed that morning from a farmer. She had never been to war before. She had no idea what game was being played. Her name was Princess. So we're just going to add that this section is probably going to be about the innocent compliance, meaning that these kids, hold on, excuse me. The innocent compliance means that these people, or who's being described, so in this instance, the German Shepherd, is going to be innocently compliant to German orders. Because at that time, right, this is World War II, the Nazis were very, very prevalent and very demanding, so to speak. Two of the Germans were boys in their early teens. Two were ramshackled old men, droolers as toothless as carp. They were irregulars, armed and clothed fragmentarily with junk taken from real soldiers who were newly dead. So it goes. They were farmers from just across the German border, not far away. Their commander was a middle-aged corporal, red-eyed, scrawny, tough as dried beef, sick of war. He had been wounded 4 times and patched up and sent back to war. He was a very good soldier, about to quit, about to find somebody to surrender to. His bandy legs were thrust into golden cavalry boots, which he had taken from a dead Hungarian colonel on the Russian front. So it goes. So I'm just going to add this bracket here as well. That these 3 paragraphs, if you would like to use them for your CER, is that we, as the first chapter in this book talks about, that we like to glorify war, and this is the ugly part of war. So I'm also going to add that. It's what we have been scared to talk about for a very, very long time. Those boots were almost all he owned in this world. They were his home. An anecdote, one time a recruit was watching him bone and wax these golden boots, and he held one up to the recruit and said, "If you look in there deeply enough, you'll see Adam and Eve." Billy Pilgrim had not heard this anecdote, but lying on the back of the ice there, Billy stared into the patina of the corporal's boots, saw Adam and Eve in the golden depths. They were naked. They were so innocent, so vulnerable, so eager to behave decently. Billy Pilgrim loved them. I think that the author is trying to make a metaphor here. That about how Adam and Eve are equal to the colonel, the teen boys, and Princess. I make this argument because of the quote, "They were so innocent, so vulnerable, so eager to behave decently." With that, I think that is symbolism and a metaphor more appropriately titled, because the old farmers, and I forgot the old men, The old farmers, the teen, the dogs, the colonel, they are all sick of the war. Everybody's sick of the war. But at the end of the day, they want to appease their country. They believe that if they help their country in the war front, then the war will be over sooner. Next to the golden boots were a pair of feet which were swaddled in rags. They were crisscrossed by canvas straps, were shod with hinged wooden clogs. Billy looked up at the face that went with the clogs. It was the face of a blonde angel of a 15-year-old boy. The boy was as beautiful as Eve. See, kind of solidifying that they're innocent and they're vulnerable, that they haven't had the corruption of war yet, unlike the colonel. Billy was helped to his feet by the lovely boy, by the heavenly androgen, and the others came forward to dust the snow off Billy, and they searched him for weapons. He didn't have any. The most dangerous thing they found on his person was a 2-inch pencil stub. 3 offensive bangs came far away. They came from German rifles. The 2 scouts who had ditched Billy and Wary had just been shot, and they are now lying in ambush for the Germans. They had been discovered and was shot from behind. Now they were dying in the snow, feeling nothing, turning the snow to the color of raspberry sherbet. So it goes. So Ronald Wary was the last of the 3 musketeers. And Wary, bug-eyed with terror, was being disarmed. The corporal gave Wary's pistol to the pretty boy. He marveled at Wary's cruel trench knife, said in German that Wary would no doubt like to use the knife on him, to tear his face off with the spiked knuckles, to stick the blade into his belly or throat. He spoke no English, and Billy and Wary understood no German. Nice playthings you have, the corporal told Wary, and he handed the knife to an old man. Isn't that a pretty thing, He tore open Wary's overcoat and blouse. Brass buttons flew like popcorn. The corporal reached into Wary's gaping bosom as though he meant to tear out his pounding heart, but he brought out Wary's bulletproof Bible instead. A bulletproof Bible is a Bible small enough to be slipped into a soldier's breast pocket over his heart and sheathed in steel. The corporal found the dirty picture of the woman and the pony in Wary's hip pocket. What a lucky pony, eh? He says, Don't you wish you were that pony? He handed the picture to the other old man. Spoils of war, it's all yours, you lucky lad. He then made Wary sit down in the snow and take off his combat boots, which he gave to the beautiful boy. He gave Wary the boy's clogs, so Wary and Billy were both without decent military footwear now, and they had to walk for miles and miles with Wary's clogs clagging and Billy bobbing up and down, crashing into Wary from time to time. Excuse me, Billy would say, or I beg your pardon. They were brought at last to the stone cottage at the fork of the road. It was a collecting point for prisoners of war. Billy and Wary were taken inside, where it was warm and smoky. There was a fire sizzling and popping in the fireplace. The fuel was furniture. There were about 20 other Americans in there, sitting on the floor with their backs to the wall, staring into the flames, thinking whatever there was to think, which was zero. Nobody talked. Nobody had any good war stories to tell. I'm just going to highlight this part right here because I think this is a great quote for you guys. That at the end of the day, what is a good war story? If you were in war, what would be your good war story? About the men you've killed, the children you've killed, the women you've killed? How is that a good war story? Billy and Wary found places for themselves, and Billy went to sleep with his head on the shoulder of an unprotesting captain. The captain was a chaplain. He was a rabbi. He had been shot through the hand. Billy traveled in time, opened his eyes, found himself staring into the glass eyes of a jade-green mechanical owl. The owl was hanging upside down from a rod of stainless steel. The owl was Billy's optometer in his office in Ilium. An optometer is an instrument for measuring refractive errors in the eyes in order that corrective lenses may be prescribed. Billy had fallen asleep while examining a female patient who was in the chair on the other side of the owl. He had fallen asleep at work. Had been a funny thing at first. Now Billy was starting to get worried about his mind in general. He tried to remember how old he was. He couldn't. He tried to remember what year it was. He couldn't remember that either. Let's talk about that. So we are now, he's an adult, and he's at his office. Doctor, said the patient tentatively. You're so quiet. Sorry. You were just talking away there, and then you got so quiet. Did you see something terrible? Terrible? Some disease in my eyes? No, said Billy, wanting to doze off again. Your eyes are just fine. You just need glasses for reading. He told her to go across the corridor and see the wide selection of frames there. When she was gone, Billy opened the drapes and was no wiser as to what was outside. The view was still blocked by the Venetian blind, which he hoisted chatteringly. Bright sunlight came crashing in. There were thousands of parked automobiles out there, twinkling on the vast lake of blacktop. Billy's office was part of a suburban shopping center. Right outside the window was Billy's own Cadillac Eldorado Coupe de Ville. He read the stickers on the bumper. Visit a suable chasm, said one. Support your police department, said another. There was a third. Impeach Earl Warren, it said. The stickers about the police and Earl Warren were gifts from Billy's father-in-law, a member of the John Birch Society. The date on the license plate was 1967, which would make Billy Pilgrim 44 years old. He asked himself, where have all the years gone? Just going to add that for reference when we make our timeline. Billy turned his attention to his desk. There was an open copy of the Review of Optometry there. It was open to an editorial, which Billy now read, his lips moving slightly. What happens in 1968 will rule the fate of European optometrists for at least 50 years, Billy read. With this warning, Jean Threart, Secretary of National Union of Belgium Optometrists, is pressing for information of European Optometry Society. The alternatives, he said, will be obtaining a professional status or, by 1971, reduction of rural spectacle sellers. Billy tried hard to care. A siren went off, scared the hell out of him. He was expecting a Third World War at that time. The siren was simply announcing high noon. It was towels at a cupola atop a firehouse across the street from Billy's office. We're also going to highlight this. And we're going to ask if it's PTSD. Well, we're not going to ask, we're going to say that is 100% PTSD. Billy closed his eyes. When he opened them, he was back in the Second World War again. His head was on the wounded rabbi's shoulder. A German was kicking his feet, telling him to wake up, and it was time to move on. The Americans, with Billy among them, formed a fool's parade on the road outside. There was a photographer present, a German war correspondent with a Leica. He took pictures of Billy and Ronald Ware's feet. The picture was widely published 2 days later as heartening evidence of how miserably equipped the American army often was, despite its reputation for being rich. The photographer wanted something more lively, though, a picture of an actual capture, so the guards staged one for him. They threw Billy into shrubbery. When Billy came out of the shrubbery, his face wreathed with goofy goodwill. They menaced him with their machine pistols as though they were capturing him then. Billy's smile as he came out of the shrubbery was at least as peculiar as Mona Lisa's, for he was simultaneously on foot in Germany in 1944 and riding his Cadillac in 1967. Germany dropped away, and 1967 became bright and clear, free of interference from any other time. Billy was on his way to the Lions Club luncheon meeting. It was a hot August, and Billy's car was air-conditioned. He stopped by a signal in the middle of Ilium's black ghetto. The people who lived there hated it so much that they burned down a lot of it the month before. It was all they had, and they'd wrecked it. The neighborhood reminded Billy of some towns in the neighborhood he'd seen in the war. The curbs and the sidewalks were crushed in many ways, showing where the National Guard tanks and half tracks had been. Blood Brother read a message written in pink paint on the side of the shattered grocery store. There was a tap on Billy's window. A black man was out there. He wanted to talk about something. The light changed. Billy did the simplest thing. He drove on. Billy drove through a scene of even greater desolation. It looked like Dresden after the firebombed like the surface of the moon. The house where Billy had grown up used to be somewhere in what was now empty. This was an urban renewal. A new Millennium Government Center and a pavilion of arts and a Peace Legion and high-rise apartment buildings were going up there soon. This was all right with Billy Pilgrim. The speaker at the Lions Club meeting was a major in the Marines. He said that Americans had no choice but to keep fighting in Vietnam until they achieved victory or until the communists realized they could not force their way of life on weak countries. The major had been there on 2 separate tours of duty. He told many of the terrible and wonderful things he had seen. He was in favor of increased bombing North Vietnam back into the Stone Age if it refused to see reason. Billy was not moved to protest the bombing of North Vietnam, nor did not shudder about the hideous things he himself had seen bombing do. He was simply having lunch at the Lions Club, which of course, of which he was past president now. Billy had framed a prayer in his office wall which expressed his method for keep going, even though he was unenthusiastic about living. A lot of patients who saw the prayer on Billy's wall told him that it helped them to keep going, and it went like this. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom always to tell the difference. Among the things Billy Pilgrim could not change were the past, the present, and the future. Now he was being introduced to the Marine Major. The person who was performing the introduction and was telling the Major that Billy was a veteran and that Billy had a son who was a sergeant in the Green Berets in Vietnam. The Major told Billy that the Green Berets were doing a great job and that he should be proud of his son. I am. I certainly am, said Billy Pilgrim. I wanted to highlight this right here. My theory about the book is that the author is making this inference to us. A lot of people with PTSD will keep reliving past events in order to try understanding what happened, things that could have been prevented, but know that they cannot change it. And at least Billy Pilgrim is conscious enough to understand that he cannot change the past. He went home for a nap after lunch. He was under doctor's orders to take a nap every day. The doctor hoped that this would relieve a complaint that Billy had. Every so often, for no apparent reason, Billy Pilgrim would find himself weeping. No one had ever caught Billy doing that. Only the doctor knew. It was an extremely quiet thing Billy did, and not very moist. Another PTSD response. Billy owned a lovely Georgian home in Ilium. He was rich as Croesus, something he had never expected to be, not in a million years. He had 5 other optometrists working for him in the shopping plaza location, and netted over $60,000 a year. In addition, he owned a fifth of the new Holiday Inn out on Route 54 and half of the Tasty Freeze stands. Tasty Freeze was a sort of frozen custard. It gave all the pleasure that ice cream would give, without the stiffness and the bitter coldness of ice cream. Billy's home was empty. His daughter Barbara was about to warned, and she and his wife had gone downtown to pick out patterns for her crystal and silverware. There was a note saying so on the table. There were no servants. People weren't just interested in careers and domestic service anymore. There wasn't a dog either. There used to be a dog named Spot, but he died. So it goes. Billy liked Spot a lot, and Spot had liked him. Billy went to the carpeted stairway into his and his wife's bedroom. The room had flowered wallpaper. There was a double bed with the clock radio on a table beside it. Also on the table were controls for an electric blanket and a switch to turn on a gentle vibrator which was bolted to the springs of the box mattress. The trade of the name of the vibrator was called Magic Fingers. The vibrator was the doctor's idea too. Billy took off his trifocals and his coat and his necktie and his shoes, and he closed the Venetian blinds and then the drapes, and he lay down on the outside of the coverlet. But sleep did not come. Tears came instead. They seeped. Billy turned on the magic fingers, and he was jiggled as he wept. The door chimes rang. Billy got off the bed, looked down through the window at the front doorstep to see if anyone important had come to call. There was a crippled man down there, as spastic in space as Billy Pilgrim was in time. Convulsions made the man dance flappily all the time, made him change his expressions too, as though he were trying to intimidate various famous movie stars. Another cripple was ringing the doorbell across the street. He was on crutches. He had only one leg. He was so jammed between his crutches that his shoulders hid his ears. Billy knew what the cripples were up to. They were selling subscriptions to magazines that would never come. People subscribed to them because the salesmen were so pitiful. Billy had heard about this racket from a speaker at the Lions Club 2 weeks before, a man from the Better Business Bureau. He said that anybody who saw cripples working a neighborhood for magazine subscriptions to call the police. Billy looked down the street, saw a new Buick Rivera parked about a block and a half away. There was a man in it, and Billy assumed correctly that he was the man who had hired the cripples to do his thing. Billy went on weeping as he contemplated the cripples and their boss. His door chimes clanged hellishly. He closed his eyes again and opened them. He was still weeping, but he was in the back of Luxembourg again. He was marching with a lot of other prisoners. It was a winter wind that were bringing tears to his eyes. Ever since Billy had been thrown into the shrubbery for the sake of the picture, he had been seeing St. Elmo's fire, a sort of electronic radiance around the heads of his companions and captors. It was on treetops in Luxembourg too. It was beautiful. Billy was marching with his hands on top of his head, and so were all the other Americans. Billy was bobbing up and down, up and down. Now he crashed into Roland Wary accidentally. "I beg your pardon," he said. Wary's eyes were tearful too. Wary was crying because of the horrible pains in his feet. The hinge clogs were transforming his feet into blood puddings. At each road intersection, Billy's group was joined by more Americans with their hands on top of their haloed heads. Billy smiled for them all. They were moving like water, downhill all the time. They flowed till at last to a main highway on the valley's floor. Through the valley flowed a Mississippi of humiliated Americans. Tens of thousands of Americans shuffled eastward, hands clasped to the top of their heads. They sighed and groaned. Billy and his group joined the river of humiliation, and late afternoon sun came down from the clouds. The Americans didn't have the road to themselves. The westbound lane boiled and boomed with vehicles which were rushing Germans' reserves to the front. The reserves were violent, wind-burned, bristly men. They had teeth like piano keys. They were festooned with machine gun belts, smoked cigars, and guzzled booze. They took wolf-fish bites from sausages, patted their horny palms with potato masher grenades. One soldier in black was having a drunk herd's picnic all by himself on the top of the tank. He spit on the Americans. The spit hit Ronald Wary's shoulder, gave Wary a furor of snot and blutwurst and tobacco juice and schnapps. Billy found the late afternoon stingingly exciting. There was so much to see: dragon's teeth, killing machine, corpses with bare feet that were blue and ivory. So it goes, bobbing up and down, up and down. Billy beamed lovingly at the bright lavender farmhouse that had been spattered with machine gun bullets. Standing in its cockeyed doorway was a German colonel. With him was his unpainted horror. Billy crashed into Wary's shoulder, and Wary cried out sobbingly, "Walk right, walk right." They were climbing into a gentle rise now, and when they reached the top, they weren't in Luxembourg anymore, they were in Germany. A motion picture camera was set up at the border to record the famous victory. Two civilians in bearskin coats were leaning on the camera when Billy and Wary came by. They had run out of film hours ago. One of them singled out Billy's face for a moment, then focused at infinity again. There was a tiny plume of smoke at infinity. There was a battle there. People were dying there. So it goes. When the sun went down and Billy found himself bobbing in place at the railroad yard, there were rows and rows of boxcars waiting. They had brought reserves to the front. Now they were going to take the prisoners into Germany's territory. Flashlight beams danced crazily. The Germans sorted out the prisoners according to rank. They put sergeants with sergeants, majors, and so on. A squad full of colonels was halted near Billy. One of them had double pneumonia. He had a high fever and vertigo. As the rail yard dipped and swooped around the colonel, he tried to hold himself steady by staring into Billy's eyes. The colonel coughed and then said to Billy, "You one of my boys?" This was a man who had lost his entire regime, about 4,500 men, a lot of them children, actually. Billy didn't reply. The question made no sense. "What was your outfit?" said the colonel. He coughed and coughed. Every time he inhaled, his lungs rattled with greasy paper bags. Billy couldn't remember the outfit he was from. "Were you from the 451st? 451st what?" said Billy. There was a silence. Infantry regime, the colonel said at last. "Oh," said Billy Pilgrim. There was another long silence, with the colonels dying and dying, drowning where he stood, and then cried out wetly, "It's me, boys, it's Wild Bob." That is what he had always wanted his troops to call him, Wild Bob. None of the people who could hear him were actually from his except for Ronald Wary, and Wary wasn't listening at all. All Wary could think of was the agony of his own feet. But the colonel imagined that he was addressing his beloved troops for the last time, and he told them that they had nothing to be ashamed of, that there were dead Germans all over the battlefield who wished to God they had never heard of the 451st. He said that after the war he was going to have a regimental reunion in his hometown, which was Cody, Wyoming. He was going to barbecue whole steers. He said all this while staring into Billy's eyes. He made the inside of Bill's skull echo with balderdash. "God be with you, boys," he said, that echoed and echoed and echoed. And then he said, "If you're ever in Cody, Wyoming, just ask for Wild Bob. I was there. So was my old war buddy, Bernard V. O'Hare." Billy Pilgrim was packed into a boxcar with many other privates. He and Ronald Wary were separated. Wary was packed into another car in the same train. There were narrow ventilators at the corners of the car, under the eaves. Billy stood by one of these, and as the crowd pressed against him, he climbed partway up a diagonal corner brace to make more room. He placed his eyes on a level with the ventilator so he could see another train about 10 yards away. Germans were writing on the cars with blue chalk the number of persons in each car, their rank, their nationality, the date in which they had been put aboard. Other Germans were securing the clasps on the car doors with wire spikes and other trackside trash. Billy could almost hear somebody writing on his car too, but he couldn't see who was doing it. More of the privates on Billy's car were very young, at the end of childhood, but crammed into a corner with Billy was a former hobo who was 40 years old. I've been hungrier than this," the hobo told Billy. "I've been in worse places than this. This ain't so bad." The man in the boxcar across the way called out through the ventilator that a man had just died in there. So it goes. There were 4 guards who heard him. They weren't very excited by the news. "Yo, yo," said one, nodding dreamily. "Yo, yo." And the guards didn't open the car with the dead man in it. They opened the car next instead, and Billy was enchanted by what was in there. It was like heaven. There was candlelight. There were bunks with quilts and blankets heaped on them. There was a cannonball stove and a steaming coffee pot on top. There was a table with a bottle of wine and a loaf of bread and a sausage on it. There were 4 bowls of soup. These were pictures. There were pictures of castles and lakes and pretty girls on the wall. This was the rolling home of the railroad guards, men whose business it was to be forever guarding freight rolling from here to there. The 4 guards went inside and closed the door. A little while later, they came out smoking cigars, taking contentedly in mellow lower register of German language. One of them saw Billy's face at the ventilator. He wagged a finger at him in an affectionate warning, telling him to be a good boy. The Americans across the way told the guards again about the dead man on their car. The guards got a stretcher out of their cozy car, opened the dead man's car, and went inside. The dead man's car wasn't crowded at all. There was just 6 live colonels in there and 1 dead one. The Germans carried out the corpse. The corpse was Wild Bob. So it goes. During the night, some of the locomotives began to tootle to one another and then to move. The locomotive and the last car of each train was marked with a striped banner of orange and black, indicating that the train was not fair game for airplanes and that it was carrying prisoners of war. The war was nearly over. Locomotives began to move east in late December. The war would end in May. German prisoners everywhere were absolutely full, and there was no longer any food for prisoners to eat, and no longer any fuel to keep them warm. And yet, here came more prisoners. Billy's train, the longest train of all, did not move for 2 days. This ain't bad, the hobo told Billy on the second day. This ain't bad at all. Billy looked out through the ventilator. The railroad yard was a desert now, except for a hospital train marked with a red cross on a siding far, far away. Its locomotive whistled. The locomotive of Billy Pilgrim's train whistled back. They were saying, hello. Even though Billy's train wasn't moving, its boxcars were kept locked tight. Nobody was to get off until the final destination. To the guards who walked up and down outside, each car became a single organism which ate and drank and excreted through its ventilators. It talked or sometimes yelled through its ventilators too. And when in went water and loaves of black bread and sausage and cheese, and came out shit and piss and language. Human beings in there were excreting into steel helmets, which were passed to people at the ventilators who dumped them. Billy was a dumper. The human beings also passed canteens, which officers would fill with water. When food came in, the human beings were quiet and trusting and beautiful. They shared. The human beings in there took turns standing or lying down. The legs of those who stood were like fence posts driven into a warm, squirming, fatting, sighing earth. The queer earth was a mosaic of sleepers who nestled like spoons. Now the train began to creep eastward. Somewhere in there was Christmas. Billy nestled into a spoon with the hobo on Christmas night. He fell asleep, and he traveled in time to 1967 again, the night he was kidnapped by a flying saucer to Tralfamadore. All right. So all of this right here is talking again about the cons of war. It is discussing how bad conditions were. So the big thing with this chapter is that we didn't travel too much. We really just traveled between 1944 and 1967. And the big thing to take away from this chapter is that Billy is now a prisoner of war on transit to unknown destination. All right, yeah, I think that is all we're going to do for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please hit that like and subscribe button, and I will see you guys later.